One might argue that if the Alpha King had spared a single honest glance at the woman fate had carved out for him, none of what came after would ever have happened. But then, if Lyra had been born to a softer name and a warmer hall, perhaps he'd have looked. So really, if you followed the thread all the way down to where it knotted, the whole ruin was his doing, every last strand of it. Lyra had known since dawn that the choosing would go badly. She simply hadn't understood how far a thing could fall once it started. She stood at the foot of the Ashfell dais in her cleanest greys, which were still a warden's greys, patched at one elbow where a hookthorn had caught her on the Deadwood Run 3 nights back. Around her the great hall glittered. The highborn wore silver at their throats and boredom on their faces, and every one of them knew what she had apparently been the last to learn, that the Alpha King had a faded Luna, and that he did not want her. He came in without hurry. Osric always moved as though the ground had agreed in advance to be where he put his feet. He was beautiful, the way a drawn blade is beautiful, and he wore the crown of Ashfell like it bored him, and when his pale eyes crossed the hall and found her standing there, they did not so much as pause. That was the first cut and it was clean, and she felt it anyway. "You know why you were summoned," said the Alpha King. He did not say her name. "I know what the pack is saying," Lyra answered. Her voice came out steadier than she was. "I'd rather hear it from you." A ripple went through the court at that. A warden, speaking plainly to the king. Osric's mouth curved, not warmly. Beside him, on the step where a Luna ought to stand, was a woman Lyra had never seen. Copper-haired, gowned in high-reach gold, lovely in the practiced way of women who had never once had to be anything else. She looked at Lyra the way one looks at a stain on good stone. "This is Cyrene," Osric said, "of high reach. Her father brings me 400 spears and the whole of the river country. In a month she will be crowned Luna of Ashfell." He let that settle. "You will understand that a king cannot bind his line to a border warden of no name simply because the moon saw fit to tie a thread between us. The thread was in error. I mean to correct it." Somewhere behind her Lyra heard Tamsin's breath go sharp. She heard Wick whisper no under his own tongue. She heard, very distantly, her own heart, still stupidly hopeful, still waiting for the part where he took it back. He did not take it back. "Lyra of the Deadwood." Osric's voice dropped into the old cadence, the formal one, the one that could not be unsaid once spoken. "I renounce the bond the moon laid between us. I cast you from my side, my hearth, and my name. Be nothing of mine." The severing was not a metaphor. She had heard the rejected speak of it in low voices and had never believed a word could carry so much weight. But the bond she'd carried quietly since her 17th winter, the warm, patient thread she had never once been allowed to name aloud, tore loose inside her chest like a tendon off the bone. She made a sound. She hated that. She made a sound. The hall watched a warden go gray, and buckle at the knees, and catch herself on nothing but pride, and Cyrene, of high reach, smiled down at her, small and satisfied, and Osric had already turned away. "See her out," he said. "To no one, to everyone. Gently, if she permits it." She permitted nothing. Lyra got her feet back under her by force of will, because the alternative was being carried, and she would burn the hall down before she let them carry her. She walked the length of that glittering room, with a wound no one could see leaking the warmth out of her, and she did not run until the doors had shut behind her and the cold of the outer yard hit her face. Then she ran. She ran past the kennels and the smithy and the gate the night wardens left unbarred for their own, out under the black teeth of the deadwood where the torchlight gave up, and the real dark began. She ran until the running turned to stumbling, and the stumbling put her on her knees in the wet leaf mold, both arms wrapped around the hole in her own chest. And there, finally, where no high-born eye could see it, she let herself come apart. Sar. She did not hear him arrive. That more than anything was what told her what he was. Nothing came through the deadwood without her knowing. She had wardened this border for 6 years. She could name a fox by the weight of its step. but the presence that unfolded out of the dark behind her arrived the way weather arrives, the way a change in pressure sits on the back of the neck before the first thunder, and when she twisted round with her knife already in her fist, her whole body understood before her mind did that the knife was a joke. He was enormous, and he was still, and the dark did not seem to touch him so much as belong to him. Not a wolf. Something the wolf in her cowered from and yearned toward in the same breath. Some older and higher thing that the packs told children about to make them behave. Eyes like banked coals found her crouched and bleeding in the mud, and moved, slow and thorough, over the raw place at her sternum where an alpha's rejection still smoked. She got the knife up anyway. It was a warden's reflex, and it was worthless, and they both knew it. She was on her knees in the wet with her chest torn open, and her hands unsteady, and the thing in front of her had not so much as shifted its weight. "Come no closer," she said, and hated how thin it came out. He tilted his head, and something that was almost amusement moved through the dark. He did come closer, one slow step, then another, until the wet leaf mold gave under a boot the size of her two hands, and he crouched, unhurried, to put those coal-red eyes level with her own. Up close, he smelled of cold stone and old smoke, and something underneath it she had no name for and did not trust herself near. "So," said the Lycan king, in a voice like the ground turning over, "this is what Ashfell throws away." Alira woke to the conviction that the night had been a fever, and then to the far worse conviction that it had not. She was in her own narrow bunk in the warden's roost above the east gate, which meant that somehow she had gotten home, though she had no memory of the walk. The last true thing she could hold was the dark of the deadwood, and a pair of coal-red eyes, and a voice that had turned her name over like a coin. It was deciding whether to keep everything after that was smoke. She turned it over and got nothing, and filed it under the bond break took the rest, because the mind does that, she'd been told, eats the hours around a wound, so you can go on living. The hole in her chest had closed to a scar. She could feel it, when she breathed, a cold seam, where the warmth used to sit. She pressed her palm flat to it, and hated how much she wanted the warmth back. "She lives," said Tamsin from the doorway, arms folded, jaw tight. Behind her hovered Wick, and behind Wick two more gray shapes she couldn't bring into focus. "Go away," Elira croaked. Nobody went away. That was the first sign that it was bad. Wardens gave each other room. It was half the reason she'd survived among them. When Tamsin crossed instead and crouched to her level, when Wick shut the door with the exaggerated care of a man handling something that might go off, Elira felt the floor of her stomach begin a slow tilt. "Just tell me," she said. Tamsin told her Osric had ridden out at first light, not toward Highreach for the wedding, as the court expected, but the long way, west, to escort Cyrene's father back to the river country and seal the 400 spears in person. He would be some weeks on the road. In his absence, the hall had done what halls do, with a disgrace. It had begun, very efficiently, to erase her. By the Alpha's own order, Alira was struck from the warden rolls. A bond-broken Luna was an ill thing, a bad omen at a gate, a wound the whole pack could catch the ache of. She was to keep her bunk until the wedding, and then be gone. South, to whatever a nameless cast-off could make of herself in country that had never wanted her. 6 years, Wick burst out, and Tamsin's look silenced him. 6 years she's held the deadwood, and they strike her like a bad debt. It won't help her to hear it, Wick. It might help me to say it, and it was worse than being struck. In the end, it was being tidied. Already, Tamsin admitted, the quartermaster had come for her warden's seal and her gate keys. Already her name had been scraped off the duty board in the mess where it had hung above the border rota for 6 years, and the younger recruits had learned overnight to find their boots very interesting when she passed. A pack did not rage at a cast-off Luna, it simply closed over the space where she'd been, the way still water closes over a dropped stone, and pretended there had never been a stone at all. Elira barely heard them. She was doing arithmetic against the cold seam in her chest, counting what was left, not the bond. That was gone, and grieving it in front of witnesses was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not the post. A warden without a wall was just a woman with a knife and a talent for the dark. Not the pack. She had come to Ashfell at 11, half feral, and the only reason she had ever belonged to it at all was that one man had decided she would. She would have to find Alder. Whatever the court said, whatever Osric ordered, Alder had pulled her out of the ditch outside the deadwood and made a warden of a starving child. And if there was a single soul in Ashfell who would still stand at her shoulder now, it wore the warden captain's gray. Alder would not tidy her away. Alder had found her at 11 with her ribs showing through her skin and a dead man's knife in her fist, and he had not asked whose daughter she was or what she was worth. He had asked whether she could hold a line, and when she'd said yes with more spite than sense, he had believed her. Every honest thing she knew about herself, she knew because he had first seen it and named it aloud. If she could get to him, she thought, if she could just stand in that warm, cluttered record room and hear him say, "We'll manage it, child," the way he'd said it 100 times over, 100 smaller ruins, then perhaps the world would consent to hold its shape a little longer. She was reaching for that thought like a hand for a rail when the great bell over the main gate began to ring, not the watch bell, not the fire bell. The deep one, the arrival bell, the one struck only for a crowned guest, and it was ringing in a pattern the gatekeepers had clearly had to improvise, because in living memory there had been no cause to strike it at all. Tamsin was on her feet. That's a sovereign's peal. Her face had gone strange. Osric's weeks west, who in the realm outranks? She stopped. Elira watched, the same impossible thought reach her that had just reached Elira, cold and certain, and out of the old childhood stories. Bootsteps on the roost stairs. A gate runner, breathless, white to the lips, who found Elira with his eyes and not Tamsin, and that was the second sign. And it was worse than the first. "You're wanted," the boy got out. "At the gate. He asked for you." He swallowed. "By name, who did?" Elira said, though the cold seam in her chest had already told her, had begun to hum, treacherous and warm, the way a struck bell goes on singing after the blow. The runner's voice dropped to almost nothing. "The Lycan king," he said. "He didn't come for the alpha. He came for you." The Lycan king did not wait in the yard like a guest. He had come through Ashfell's open gate, as though the gate were a formality he was permitting. And by the time Elira reached the great hall, he had already made the room his. She felt it before she was through the doors. The way the air pulled taut, the way every wolf in the place stood a fraction too straight, her own scarred chest gone tight around a presence that made the hall's gray stone feel like a child's fort. In the deadwood dark, he had been a shape and a voice. Here, in daylight, with the Ashfell court pressed white-faced to the walls, he was undeniable. Broad and unhurried and terribly awake, he stood at the foot of the empty dais, Osric's dais, with the patient stillness of a thing that had never once in its life needed to hurry, because everything it wanted had always, eventually, come to it. His eyes found her the moment she entered and warmed, and that frightened her more than the stillness had. "There she is," said Lycan, "king of the Lycans," and he said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided, "my Luna." The hall did not breathe. Elira's own voice came out flat and disbelieving. "You're what? Come now." He descended the dais steps without haste, and the court flinched back from his path like grass off a wind. "You were there." 2 nights past, at the edge of the deadwood, bleeding in the mud a king had thrown you into. The moon does not care for Osric's opinions on threads and errors. It cut one bond that had gone rotten. His gaze touched the seam at her chest, and the seam, traitor that it was, warmed, and where a wolf's law leaves off, an older law begins. "You are mine now, warden, claimed and under my hand. Anyone in this hall who cares to argue the point may argue it with me." No one argued the point. Elira's mind was moving fast and getting nowhere useful. She could hear the shape of the trap even as it closed. A cast-off Luna, struck from the rolls, days from exile. That girl, the court could erase without a second thought. But a Luna claimed by the Lycan king, an apex sovereign the wolf packs had bowed to for 1,000 years, was a different creature entirely. His word laid over her disgrace, turned exile into untouchability. It was, she realized with a lurch, the only thing in the world that could have saved her, which was exactly why she didn't trust it, because she would have felt it. A true claim, an older law bond. There would be a pull, a heat, some thread laid warm across the cold seam Osric had left, and there was nothing. Only the pressure of a vast alpha and the strange, humiliating way her body leaned toward him regardless. Whatever Lucan was doing, the moon had not done it for him. She knew it the way she knew her own gate in the dark. He was standing in her ruined hall, in front of her ruined pack, inventing a bond, and daring the whole realm to call him a liar. The question was why. A moment, Lucan said to the court pleasantly, and it was not a request. With my betrothed. They emptied the hall. Kings could do that. When the last door had closed, and it was only the two of them under the high, cold rafters, Alira turned on him with the last of her nerve. "I'd know if I were yours," she said. "There's no bond. You're aware there's no bond. So whatever you've walked into Asheville to buy with my name, I'd like to hear the price before you spend me." Something moved behind the banked coals of his eyes. Not anger. Something closer to delight. "They told me you were plain and low and forgettable," he said. "The Alpha's discarded mistake. I begin to think Osric can't see." He came a step nearer, and she made herself hold the ground. "You want the truth of it. Here is as much as I'll give you today. I did not claim you for the moon's sake, and I did not claim you for yours. I claimed you because your king surrendered something without knowing what it was. And I mean for him to understand exactly what he handed to me." The cold in her chest went colder. "So I'm a message. You're a great deal more than that." "But yes," he smiled, and it was not unkind, which was somehow worse. "When Osric returns, and he will return, Borden, the moment word reaches the river country that a Lycan crown has walked into his hull, I want the first thing he sees to be you, standing at my side, wearing what he threw away." The smile sharpened to an edge. "I want him to look at what he chose, and I want him to understand, all the way down, that he cannot have it back." "And if I say no?" she asked. "If I stand up in your grand hall tomorrow and tell the whole pack there's no bond, that the Lycan king is a liar and a borrowed betrothal?" "Then I ride home to Duskholt at dawn," he said, "and by the next new moon, you're on the southern road, with a broken bond and a bad name, and the first hard winter takes what's left of you, and no one in this hall so much as remembers your face by spring." He said it without cruelty, which was the terrible part. He said it the way a man reads out the weather. "Or you wear my claim, and you're untouchable, and your border eats through my winter grain instead of starving. I'm not asking you to love me, Warden. I'm asking you to be clever. You struck me as a woman who could tell the difference." She could. That was the trouble. Every sensible bone she owned told her to take the wall he was offering and count herself lucky, and she resented him, purely and completely, for being right. Somewhere far to the west, though she could not have known it yet, a rider was already spurring hard toward the river country with that very word in his mouth. And Elira, standing alone with a king who had just told her plainly that she was bait, found herself doing the one thing her whole broken heart should have known better than to do. She started, very quietly, to keep score. By the third day it was clear the Lycan king had no intention of leaving. He had taken not a guest wing, but the Alpha's own solar, the high room over the West Range where Osric held his councils, and he sat in it, as though he'd been born there, boots off the edge of the map table, a Lycan crown Alira had only ever heard described sitting, careless on the arm of the chair. Paxtes. Ashfell's stewards crept in and out with their eyes down. The court had discovered urgent business in distant halls. And Elira, who had spent 3 days being pointed at, whispered about, and fitted by terrified seamstresses for gowns she had not asked for, walked into that solar on the 3rd morning and decided she was done being handled. "If I'm to be your message," she said, without greeting, "then I'll be paid for carrying it." Lucan looked up from the map, with the slow interest of a man who has been waiting to be entertained. "Go on. You've dressed me, you've named me, you've hung your claim on me in front of my whole pack. Fine. I can't stop you, and gods know it's the only wall between me and the southern road." She planted her hands on the map table, over the inked line of the deadwood she'd wardened for 6 years. "But, while you sit in Ashfell playing at my betrothal, the border you're squatting behind is bleeding out, so here's my price. You want me at your side, wearing what Osric threw away. Then use the crown on your knee to keep his neglect from killing the people I spent 6 years protecting. That's the bargain. My face for their winter." She'd expected him to laugh, or to grant it idly the way kings grant things they'll forget by supper. Instead, he set his feet on the floor, sat forward, and looked at the map as though he were actually seeing it. "Show me," he said. "This bleeding of yours. Show me where." She hadn't expected that either, so she showed him. She'd meant to sketch it in broad strokes and be gone, but the moment she started tracing the supply lines, something in her loosened that the whole ridiculous claim had been strangling since the deadwood. 40 measures of grain requisitioned for the border roosts every month, she told him, 12 arriving. Bowstring, lamp oil, salt, the same. The wardens flagged it up. The chain and the chain swallowed the flags whole. "It's not luck," she said, the way she'd said it 100 times, the way Alder had first taught her to see it. "It's rot. The men at the top of this pack have never once cared how a border stays standing, so it doesn't, and it's the folk in the cold who pay the shortfall." Lucan had gone very still over the map. "Where does the missing grain go?" "That's the question no one upstream will answer." She moved down the line. "It goes up, and it dies up. 6 years, I've watched supplies walk off between the granary and the gate, and never once seen a soul held to account for it." "Show me your tally rolls," he said. She blinked. "My what?" "Your rolls. The border keeps a ledger, doesn't it? Numbers, requisitioned against numbers received." He held out one broad hand, palm up, entirely serious. "You said show me." "I am asking to be shown." There was something almost boyish in it. Under all that terrible weight, the eagerness of a creature handed a puzzle it genuinely wanted to solve. Against every instinct she owned, Elira fetched the battered warden's ledger from the satchel she hadn't let out of her sight in 3 days and put it in his hand, and watched a Lycan king bend over 6 years of a border's accounting, like it was the most interesting thing in the realm. His thumb stopped on a line near the bottom of the autumn tally. She was leaning in before she could help it. "No, there," she said. "The hollow 4 double draw. 2 requisitions, 1 month, both signed and sealed, both filled. Twice the salt to the same 6 huts." She caught herself standing shoulder to shoulder with him over the page, and did not quite step back. "Somebody ordered it twice, and nobody cancelled the first. That's not neglect. That's a thing done on purpose, hidden inside the noise of everything that's merely broken." Lucan looked up at her, and they were very close, and the coal red of his eyes had banked to something thoughtful. "Who signs the second draw?" "It goes up the chain," she said. "It dies where the chain dies. Names. Warden." She reached to turn the page and tell him, and the scar at her sternum, the cold seam Osric had cut, gave a low, unbidden pulse of warmth at his nearness, and she pulled the ledger back instead, needing the distance the way a diver needs air. He let her have it. That was the maddening thing. He watched her retreat, and did not follow, and said only, "Ride the border with me, tonight. I'd see this bleeding for myself before I decide whose throat to open over it." She should have said no. She had a list, by then, of reasons to say no. "All of them sound," she said. "Bring warm cloaks. The deadwood doesn't care that you're a king." They rode out, at the cold edge of the night watch, 2 horses and no guard, because Lucan had waved his own away with an ease that should have warned her. The deadwood closed over them, black and familiar, and for a while there was only the creak of leather and the smell of wet loam, and the strange, unwilling comfort of not being alone in the dark for once. She heard it before she saw it. A scrape, stone on steel, off to the left, where the shadows pooled thick under the old boundary cairns. She'd walked this ground 1,000 nights. Nothing about it was supposed to make that sound. "Rein up," she breathed. "Quiet." "Is this?" Lucan murmured, entirely too loud. "The part where you admit the deadwood's rather romantic in the dark." She hauled his horse's head sideways by the cheek strap. The crossbow bolt meant for the space where his skull had been went past them both and buried itself in a cairn with a hard, wet crack. "Down!" she snapped, already off her own mount, dragging him with her into the lee of the stones. "Behind me. Don't move where I can't see you." Footsteps then, more than one set, spreading wide through the dark with the unhurried discipline of men who had done this before, not poachers, not border runners. She counted 4 by their weight and felt her blood go cold and clear the way it only did when there was finally something to do. They came all at once. She took the first on the turn, inside his reach before his blade was level, and put him down hard. The second she left folded around her elbow. The third came for Lucan, and she was already moving, throwing herself across the gap. And the blade meant for a king's throat caught her across the forearm instead. But she was inside his guard by then, and a hard twist sent him staggering back with the sword skittering out of his hand. A whistle cut the dark, high and clean, and the last 2 broke off as one, not fleeing, withdrawing, in good order, the way trained men withdraw when the work's gone wrong. Silence crashed back down. Elira held her crouch, blade up, her arm on fire, scanning the black. And beside her, the Lycan king rose, brushed the leaf mold from his knee, and said mildly, "You do know how to make an evening memorable." She turned on him, chest heaving. "You're not surprised. Should I be? Someone just put a bolt at your skull and you're tidying your cloak. And then it landed, cold and total. The withdrawal, the discipline, men who had done this before. This isn't the first time, is it?" She said it slowly, watching his face, for the flinch that didn't come. "Someone wants the Lycan king dead, and you rode into my dark border with no guard, laughing, because you already knew." For half a breath, something real moved behind the banked coals. There, and gone. "You're bleeding," Lucan said gently, reaching for her ruined arm. "Let me see to that." She did not give him her arm. She stood in the dark with her own blood running warm to her fingertips, and a king who wouldn't answer a straight question. And she thought, who are you? A predator playing the fool, or a fool she kept mistaking for a predator? She didn't know yet, but her list was getting longer. For the better part of 3 weeks, Elira set herself to the sensible work of finding out what the Lycan king was hiding, and instead found out something far more inconvenient about herself. It was the only reasonable response to a man who'd been shot at in her own border and shrugged it off. Someone wanted Lucan dead. She was certain of it now, surer still, when his hunter's girth turned up cut halfway through a week on, and held only because she'd checked it herself out of old habit. And so she did the thing she was good at. She watched. She gathered. She built theories and knocked them down. Was the claim a shield? A Luna he could keep at his side, without ever explaining the guard he traveled without? Was she cover for something? Every morning brought a new shape to the puzzle, and every morning the puzzle refused to hold it because the puzzle would not cooperate. She'd ask a blade-sharp question, and he'd answer with a joke. She'd press, and he'd turn it, sliding the talk sideways so smoothly she wouldn't notice she'd been steered until they were 3 subjects downstream, and he was watching her mouth. She cornered him once, flatly, on the men at the cairns. Who were they? Who paid them? And he told her she was magnificent when she was suspicious, and asked whether she knew it. He gave her nothing she could use, and a great deal she had no idea what to do with, and the longer she watched him for danger, the more she caught herself simply watching him. That was the trouble. Somewhere in those long gray weeks, she stopped wanting him gone. It came on, like weather. He took to appearing at the Blade stores in the raw hour before dawn while she checked the border rolls, and one morning he leaned his shoulder against the doorframe with the first gray light sliding down the long line of his throat, and she lost the thread of her own sentence entirely. "You stopped," he observed. "I'm thinking," she said. She was not thinking. She was looking at his mouth, and she caught herself doing it, and was furious, and it changed nothing. He came to the east wall at the cold turn of a night watch, with 2 cups of something hot, and when he handed hers across, the backs of his fingers brushed hers, and the scar at her chest lit up warm to the shoulder. She nearly dropped the cup. She covered it by glaring out at the dark. "You're not watching the stars," he murmured. His voice, low and meant only for her this close in the black, went straight down her spine. "They're stars," she managed. "They'll keep. They're rather outmatched tonight." He was looking at her openly, taking his unhurried time about it, and she, who had stared down armed men without a blink, could not hold his eyes for the length of a breath before she had to look away. He smiled into his cup like a creature that had won something, and said nothing, and let her stand there burning. That was the unbearable part. He was toying with her, and she could never tell how much of it was true. Worse, he had begun to be useful, which no one had warned her a king could be. When she brought the reordered border rota to the Solar, he read it properly, the whole of it, and asked why the hollow forward post carried 2 men where the sightlines wanted 1. And when she told him it was a standing order, no one upstream would let her cancel. As though authority were a thing you could just spend on a problem instead of hoarding against your own importance. She had stood there holding a duty roster that finally made sense for the first time in 6 years, and been furious to feel her eyes sting over it. Osric had never once asked how the border ran. This one wanted the ledgers brought to bed. She did not know which of them she was falling for, the fool or the predator, but she lay in her narrow bunk, after the late watches, with her body humming and sleep nowhere, one hand pressed to the warm seam in her chest, and let her traitor mind go where it wanted, which was straight to him. It came to a head late in the empty armory. He came in and sat on the bench across from her as though he'd done it 100 times. No ledger, no question about the watch, nothing she could file the visit under. Just him in the lamplight, watching her. "What do you want from me?" she said. It came out raw. "Lycan." "No, I'm at the end of it." Her hands weren't steady, and she was past caring. "Every day you won't say what you're after, and you won't leave me be. And I can't keep standing in this. Tell me it's a scheme. Tell me you need a blade you can trust at your back. Tell me anything that makes sense, because I was not built to want a thing I'm not allowed to have, and you are making me want it." She stopped. "Too late." "Want what?" Lycan asked, low. "Not teasing now." "Don't." She shut her eyes. "You've known for days, you've been enjoying it." He stood. He came around the bench slow, the way you approach a thing that might bolt. "And what?" he said. "If I simply want you." He was close now, close enough that she had to tip her chin to hold his eyes. "You don't believe me, so tell me to go, and I'll go. Out that door, and never trouble you again." His voice dropped to almost nothing. The armory was very quiet, her pulse was very loud, and the scar at her chest was singing. "Prove it," she heard herself say. He kissed her, and every careful, watchful, scorekeeping thing in her head went white and silent all at once. His hand slid into her hair, and his mouth was warm and certain, and there was no court to perform for, no crown, no message, only the 2 of them and the lamplight and the sudden enormous fact of him. Her knees forgot their office. She fisted a hand in his collar, and pulled him down, and kissed him back, like a woman who had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, because she had. This was not a scheme. She knew a scheme. She'd been made one. This was just a man. Wanting her for no reason, but wanting, and, God's help her list, she wanted him back. It was only much later, lying awake long after he'd gone with the memory of it still warm on her mouth, that the cold thought surfaced through the heat. He told you plainly you were bait, and you kissed him anyway. And she had no answer for it, which frightened her more than the Karens had. Barely a week after the night in the armory, the high-reach envoy arrived, and with them the feast Ashfell could not refuse to give. They came to see for themselves the rumor that had gone racing up every road in the realm, that a Lycan crown sat in the Alpha's empty hall, that the cast-off border warden Osric had thrown away, wore the Lycan king's claim at her throat. Elira had stood guard at the edge of 100 feasts. She had never once been seated at one, and certainly never in dark river silk with a Lycan king's hand resting warm at the small of her back as he steered her through a crowd that did not know whether to bow to her or spit. She had wanted to refuse the gown. It had arrived that afternoon, folded in paper, the color of deep water, and she had stood over it with her arms crossed until Tamsin had said, quietly, that a woman could armor herself in silk as well as steel if she chose to see it that way. So she kept her back to the walls out of 6 years of habit, marked every exit without meaning to, and watched the high-born watch her, the same lords who a month ago would not have met her eye in a corridor, now bowing over her hand because a Lycan had put his name to it. She found she despised the bows more than she'd ever despised the cold shoulders. At least, the cold shoulders had been honest. "Stop counting the doors," Lucan murmured against her ear, steering her past a knot of high-reach cousins. "You'll unnerve them, and they're nervous enough having me in the room." "There are 11 ways out of this hall," she said. 9, if the east stair's still barred. "I like to know." "Of course you do." And there it was again, not mockery, but a warmth, under the words, as though her counting the exits at her own betrothal feast were the most reassuring thing he'd seen all night. "You hate this," she said, when he'd walked her out onto a cold colonnade where the music thinned and the night came up off the gardens. It wasn't a guess. 3 weeks had taught her the shape of his laughter, the difference between the smile he wore and the one he meant. Lucan watched the dancers through the arch. "Hate's a strong word." "You're lying." He laughed, surprised, real. "The good one. I am, aren't I?" He turned to face her, and the easy Lycan King mask went out of his expression, and what was left underneath looked for the first time since the deadwood, tired. "I have been performing since I was a boy of 19. The certainty, the stillness, the being exactly the terror they need me to be, so that none of them look too closely at the parts of me that aren't." He stopped, shook his head. The smile he tried on was thin and defensive. "Forgive me. Too much wine, and not enough of it." "Lucan." She reached up and touched his face before she decided to. His breath caught. The false smile crumbled clean off. "Since you were 19, she repeated. "Who put a crown on a boy of 19? A plague did, and a bad winter, and an uncle who wanted the throne, and was clumsy about the wanting." He said it lightly, the way he said everything that had once cost him. "I learned very young that a Lycan who looks frightened gets a knife, and a Lycan who looks certain gets obeyed, and there is no third door. So I built the certain one, and I have lived behind it ever since. And some nights I honestly could not tell you what's still standing back there in the dark." He looked at the dancers rather than at her. "You spend enough years being what a room needs. You stop being sure there's anyone left underneath to disappoint." Elira had spent her whole life on the wrong side of grand rooms, and she knew the shape of a person holding a wall up from the inside. She had not expected to find it in him. "You're not what they think you are," she said, quietly. "You're so much more than the thing you perform. And the one underneath," she paused. "I like him quite a lot." Something cracked open behind the dark red of his eyes. And then it happened. The thing she'd stopped believing in since a colder king had cut it out of her. Warmth poured in through the place where her hand met his jaw. Relief and fear and a fierce, undefended tenderness, distinct and clear and not her own. She could feel him. The scar at her chest, the dead cold seam, flooded suddenly with living heat, and she jerked back with a gasp. Lucan's eyes had gone wide, his pupils blown. "Did you—" he started. Her heart was slamming so hard she thought he must hear it, because a claim invented for spite did not do this. Only a true bond did this. He had told her plainly. It was a message, a lie, and here it was answering across her skin, like the realest thing in the world. And she did not understand it, and she was suddenly badly afraid of it. "It was nothing," she heard herself say. "The wine! The wine!" he repeated. His face shuddered, gone careful and distant the way it did when he was hurt. "Of course! Nothing!" A servant appeared at the colonnade's edge, silver tray balanced on one palm, 2 cups of wine, dark as old blood in the moonlight. "Your Majesty," he murmured, and offered the tray. Lucan, wounded, not looking at it, reached for a cup, and Alira's wolf snarled under her skin. Every instinct she owned, screaming a single word. Wrong. She didn't think. Her hand shot out and knocked the cup from his fingers. It shattered on the flags. Her grip closed hard around his wrist. Don't touch it." She was already dropping to a crouch over the spreading dark stain, nostrils flaring. Under the fruit and the oak, a bitter almondy edge. "Wolfsbane," she said, "or something near enough to kill an alpha and worse for a Lycan. This was meant to put you down, perhaps, for good." The servant was gone into the dark before she'd finished the word. She lunged 2 steps after him and lost him where the colonnade fed into the crowded hall, one more gray coat among 200. And she could not raise the hue and cry without telling the whole feast a king had nearly died at Ashfell's table. She turned back, breathing hard. The color had drained out of Lucan's face. Not fear, she saw. Something colder, something calculating. He was already thinking, 3 moves past the poisoner, to the delegation on the far side of the wall, and the calculation frightened her more than the wolfsbane had. "Elira," his voice had gone ragged. "You will tell no one." She stared up at him. "This is the 3rd attempt on your life since you came to Ashfell. Someone in this hall just tried to murder you and you want it buried. There is a high-reach delegation 40 feet from us," he said, low and fast, "and a war balanced on a knife over which Pack fills Osric's empty seat. If word runs that a sovereign was poisoned under Ashfell's roof, at Ashfell's own feast, I will have blood in the streets before dawn, and no way to prove whose hand poured it. I need you to trust me, just this one. I know what I'm." The doors at the far end of the hall boomed open. She felt the change before she turned, the air ripping taut a second way, a second alpha's weight crashing into the first, the whole feast lurching to its feet. Down the length of the bright room rode Filthy, weeks and a hard ride from the river country, his pale eyes finding the colonnade and the dark-silked woman and the lichen hand still wrapped around her wrist, stood the Alpha King of Ashfell, home at last. Osric had returned, and he was looking straight at what he'd thrown away. Osric crossed his own hall, like a man walking to a duel, and the whole feast turned to watch him do it. Elira felt Lucan let go of her wrist, unhurried, deliberate, a thing done for an audience, and step a half-pace to put himself between her and the Alpha King, without ever seeming to move at all. The high-reach envoy had gone silent along the high table. Somewhere behind her a servant was already sweeping up the wine. She'd knocked to the flags, the poison drying between the stones, and no one but the 2 of them knew it had been there. "You're a long way from the river country," Lucan said pleasantly. "You're a long way from Dusk Holt," Osric returned. "And sitting in my hall, at my table with your hand on my—" He stopped. His pale eyes went to Elira, and something moved in them. She had spent 6 years wishing to see there, and had stopped wishing for, and it made her sick that it still had any power over her at all. On a woman of Ashfell, he finished. A woman of Ashfell, you renounced in front of your entire pack, Lucan smiled. By your own law, before witnesses. You cast her from your side, your hearth, and your name. I have it word for word, they're still repeating it in the taverns. And an older law picked up what your law threw down. She is mine now, Osric. You may take that up with the moon. She is my Luna. She was. The pleasantness went out of Lucan's voice, like a lamp pinched dark. You surrendered her, for 400 spears, and a copper-haired treaty. A king doesn't get to keep a thing he threw away, merely because someone else found it worth picking up. For one white instant, Elira thought Osric would go for his throat and turn a feast into a war. Then his gaze cut to her, to the dark silk, the Lycan claim at her collar, the way she stood without leaning on anyone, and she watched the fight drain out of him, and something worse pool in behind it. Not rage, regret. Weeks too late, and worth exactly nothing. Elira, he said low, only to her. I made an error. The word landed in her like a coal. Error. It was his word, the one he'd used on the dais, with the whole court watching. The thread was an error. I mean to correct it. And here he was a month on, wearing it inside out, offering it back to her like a gift. She understood then, with a clarity that steadied her more than any rage could have, that Osric would never once in his life reach for a word that admitted he had chosen wrongly. Only ever that he had been mistaken, as though the fault lay in the moon's arithmetic and not in the mouth that had spoken. The severing. You made a decree, she said, in front of the pack that raised me. I felt it break. Do you understand that? Not my heart. The bond. You reached into my chest in front of 400 people and you tore something out by the root because a copper-haired treaty smiled at you, and now you've seen a bigger wolf pick it up off the floor, and suddenly it's an error. She held his eyes and did not let hers fill. Enjoy your treaty, your majesty. She turned and walked out of the hall before he could answer. And she did not run, and it was the hardest thing she'd done since the deadwood. She meant to go to her bunk. She went instead, on some cold instinct she couldn't name, toward the warden captain's record room, in the West Range, Alder's room, the one warm, honest place in Ashfell, where the man who'd hauled her out of a ditch at 11 kept his ledgers and his lamp, and always had time for her. She wanted the one person in the realm who'd never once lied to her. The door was ajar. There was a light inside, and when she pushed it open, it was not Alder, bent over the warden captain's account books. It was Lucan. He had a sheaf of Alder's private tally rolls in one hand, and for the first time since she'd met him, the Lycan king, who always had his answer before you'd finished the question, paused. Say something, she willed him, and did not need to say it aloud. His jaw tightened. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. Someone put wolfsbane in your cup not an hour ago, she said, and her voice came out very flat. You told me to tell no one, and then you came straight down here in the dark to go through my captain's private books. So, tell me, Lucan, right now, what is going on? He set the rolls down. When he spoke, his voice had gone quiet and terribly gentle. The careful one. The one he used on frightened lords. The one he had not used on her in 3 weeks. I've been hunting a traitor since before I ever set foot in Ashfell, he said. The men at the cairns carried coin, minted for a river house. The poison tonight came in on a high-reach tray. And every thread of it, when I follow it back, runs to the same hand, the supplies that never reach your border. The orders that contradict each other, the grain that walks off between the granary and the gate. He held her eyes and did not look away from what he was about to do to her. Your hollow ford, double draw, Elira. It's not the only one. Someone has been bleeding Ashfell dry for years, and feeding the coin to men who want a Lycan crown dead, so the packs fall into a war. and the hand at the center of it, the name on every cooked ledger in this room, is Alder's. The floor went out from under her. "No," she said. "Elira?" "No," she backed into the doorframe. He went still at once, the way a hunter stills when the quarry's head comes up. "Not Alder. You don't. You have no idea who he is. He found me in the dirt. He's the only one in this whole pack who ever—" She couldn't finish it, because underneath the roar of "not Alder, never Alder," something cold and quiet had begun, quietly, to assemble itself. "You needed someone inside Ashfell," she heard herself say. "Someone close to him. Someone the pack trusted." Her voice cracked down the middle. "That's why you claimed me? Not the moon. Not spite at Osric. You needed a way in, and a cast-out warden, with a grudge, and the run of the border walked straight out of the deadwood and handed you one." He said nothing. He held her eyes, and did not deny it. "Tell me I'm wrong," she whispered. "Lycan." "Say I'm wrong." He looked at her for a long moment, and he did not say she was wrong. She pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes. She'd been so stupid. He'd kept asking his questions. The ledgers, the roster. Who signed the second draw? Who held the granary keys when the captain was away? And she had thought, God's help her, that he was interested in the border. In her. "All of it," she said into her hands. It was all a way in. Not all of it. He came around the desk and she retreated into the corridor. And he stopped again, hands open at his sides. "I won't pretend the claim didn't start as a road to Alder, but it stopped being that weeks ago, and you felt it stop tonight, on the colonnade, when the bond you keep insisting isn't real answered across your own skin. Don't." She was already turning away. "There's a traitor loose in this palace," you said. "So go and prove it to someone who can still stand to look at you." And she walked out into the dark of the corridor, with her whole heart in pieces behind her. She got 10 paces before a shape unfolded from the shadows at the end of the passage, where it had, she would realize far too late, been waiting. "Elira," said Alder gently, opening his arms the way he had when she was 11 and starving. "Child, you're white as death. What's happened?" She almost went to him. That was the thing she would turn over for years afterward. That even then, with Lycan's words still bleeding in her ears, her body took a full step toward the man who'd raised her before her mind caught the reins. "Something's happened," she said instead, and let her voice shake, because it did not have to be forced. "Lycan, the Lycan king. Alder, I think he's—" She pressed a hand over her mouth. Alder's face softened into sorrow. "I know," he said. "I hoped to spare you this. Come, sit, before you fall." He drew her down the corridor, one arm heavy and familiar across her shoulders, and lowered his voice to the register he'd used to teach her to read a trail. "I've kept it from you as long as I could, but you'll hear it tonight, regardless, so let it come from someone who loves you. That creature you let claim you, Elira, he is not what he plays at. An hour ago, at the height of the feast, he went to the high-reach girl, Cyrene. He drugged her, compromised her, meant her to be found ruined so her father would have no choice but to break the alliance and hand the river country to whichever house steadied the realm after." His jaw hardened. "I saw it with my own eyes. Not an hour passed." Elira stood very still inside the circle of his arm, and let the words fall into place, and the place they fell into was wrong. An hour ago, Lycan had been on the colonnade with her hand on his face, and a poisoned cup shattering at his feet. She had not been 3 paces from him. He had not gone near Cyrene, or anyone. The timeline didn't fit. The timeline was a lie. And a lie in Alder's mouth meant that everything Lycan had said in that record room was true. The ledgers, the coin, the hand at the center of it all. The man with his arm around her shoulders, murmuring "child" into her hair, was the traitor, and he was lying to her face. Her hand twitched toward the knife at her belt. Old instinct. She stilled it. Not here. Not one woman in a corridor, against the warden captain, who commanded the loyalty of every soldier in Ashfell. He expected her hurt, and reeling and hungry to believe the worst of the king who'd used her. So she let her face crumple and leaned into his side and said, "What do we do?" Alder's eyes sharpened. "We go to Lord Bevan," he said, "before the Lycan can spin it. A high king who would drug a man's daughter under a peace banner isn't fit to rule the Pax, and there are good houses ready to steady things once he's fallen." His voice went soft and kind, the voice from 100 campfires. "But it can't come from me. I'm a captain. They'll call it a grab for power. It has to come from someone. Bevan will believe, without a breath of doubt." He turned her gently to face him. "It has to come from you, Alira." "The Lycan King's own," claimed Luna. "If you tell him what the Lycan did, no soul in that room will question a word." She made herself nod. And she thought, "You taught me to walk into a killing ground smiling. Let's see how you like it." The walk to the East Council room was the longest of her life. She had to get into that chamber, turn Alder's trap inside out in front of a grief-maddened foreign king, and she had nothing to do it with but her own word and one crack in a timeline. And if she put a single foot wrong, she'd hand the realm a war. Lord Bevan of Highreach had taken the council room. Lucan was already there, standing to one side under guard eyes, and when Elira came in at Alder's shoulder, his whole face lit for half a heartbeat. Then he saw whose shoulder she stood at, and the light went out of him like a snuffed wick. He thought she'd come to bury him. "My lord," Alder said, bowing to Bevan, "it grieves me past speaking, but your daughter has been wronged tonight by the creature at your peace table." He laid it out, clean and terrible. The drugging, the ruin, the alliance the Lycan meant to shatter. Cyrene, pale and confused, and clearly unharmed beneath the arranged distress, sat wide-eyed at her father's side. "That is a lie," Lucan said quietly. "Every word of it is his." "He would say so," said Alder, and spread his hands to the room, but the Lycan's own bride stood witness. "She has no cause to shield me, and every cause to shield the man she's bound to." He turned, and the whole chamber turned with him, to Alira, silent by the door. "Ask her, my lord. Alira, tell his majesty what you saw." Every face in the room swung to her, Bevan leaning forward, desperate for justice. Alder, certain, already counting his win. And Lucan, who thought she'd come to finish him, holding her eyes with the flat calm of a man who has decided not to beg. "I'm sorry," she told him, with no words at all. "I should have believed you an hour ago." Then she faced Lord Bevan directly. "I saw nothing of the sort," she said, "because it never happened. Captain Alder is lying to you." The room drew tight as a bowstring. "He says it happened within the hour." Her voice held. "But within the hour, the Lycan King was on the west colonnade with me, in full sight, where someone put wolfsbane in his cup. I struck it from his hand myself, the stain still on the flagstones. He never went near your daughter." She lifted her chin. "There have been 3 attempts on King Lucan's life since he came to Ashfell. Men at the cairns, carrying river house coin. A cut girth. Poison on a Highreach tray tonight. Search the warden captain's quarters, my lord, now while he's stood here in front of you and can't reach them, and see whether you find a wronged girl's proof or a paymaster's ledger and enough wolfsbane to drop an Alpha King." "This is hysteria," Alder said, and his voice cracked on it. "She's distraught. She's the Lycan's creature. She—" "Then a search costs you nothing," said Lord Bevan, very quietly, and nodded to his guards. For one breath, the room hung on the balance of it, and Elira made herself meet Alder's eyes across the council stone, because she owed the man who'd raised her that much, to be looking at him when he understood that she had done it, that the starving child he'd pulled from the dirt had grown into the one blade in Ashfell he could not turn. She had braced for rage. What she had not braced for was the flicker of something, almost like pride, there and gone, before the rest arrived. And then the rest arrived, and Alder's face changed. The grave, kind captain she'd loved for 16 years, came off like a mask, and what stood underneath it was cornered. He ran. He came straight at her, the knife sliding out of his sleeve, half a beat, before he reached her, because, of course it was her, she was the one who'd unmade him. But this was the one thing in a whole ruined night she knew in her bones how to do. She turned into him instead of away, caught the knife arm at the wrist, and used his own weight to put him face down on the cold council stone. Her knee dropped between his shoulders. She bent to his ear. "You trained me," she said. "You should have remembered what I'm good at." Then the guards had him, and hauled him up and dragged him out, and it was done. The council room emptied by degrees. Devon went to his daughter, safe, untouched, never harmed. The advisors hurried off in tight, murmuring knots. And then it was only the two of them under the cold rafters, and Lycan hadn't moved, and he was looking at her, the way a man looks at something he thought he'd lost. "You saved my life," he said. "Even after everything. You still, I stopped a traitor." She kept her voice flat as beaten iron. "That's all it was. He was bleeding my border and hiring men to kill you, and I don't let murderers walk." Not 1 second of it was forgiveness. The light in his face guttered. "Illyra, the bond. It's real. You felt it tonight." "I know you did. It doesn't matter if it's real. Ford Bowl." She was already turning for the door, because if she looked at him a moment longer, her voice would break, and she needed it not to. "You looked me in the eye for 3 weeks, and used me for a road to Alder. You can call it a bond, a claim, the moon's own will. A thing that starts as a lie doesn't get to keep whatever it grows into." She reached the door. "I'm glad you're alive, Your Majesty. You'll make a fine High King, Illyra. Please." "But I can't trust you," she said. "I don't know that I ever will again." And she saw it land in his eyes, the understanding that he had broken something that would not come back whole, and she walked out into the dark before it could pull her back. She had been warden captain of Ashfell for 5 months, and she was good at it, and she had always known she would be. The border ran clean now. Every rotten line Alder had worked into it for a decade had been cut out and cauterized. The grain reached the roosts, the folk in the cold had their winter, and Alder himself sat in a cell beneath the old fort awaiting a judgment no one doubted. Lord Bevan's alliance had held a true one this time, not a thing bought with a woman's ruin. And Osric, king of Ashfell, had spent those 5 months learning exactly what it was to have thrown his own mate to the moon on a traitor's council and watched a greater king pick her up. He had tried, of course. He came to her a month in the pale hour after a dawn watch, and stood in the door of the warden captain's room, with his crown in his hands like a supplicant. "I've dissolved the High Reach match," he said. "Cyrene's gone home. Illyra, I was made a fool of. Alder pushed me to the treaty, pushed me from you, and I was too proud to see the hand on my back. If I'd known." "If you'd known?" she repeated. She set down her pen. "Osric, you didn't renounce me because Alder tricked you. Alder gave you a reason, and you took it because a border warden of no name embarrassed a king, and 400 spears did not." She stood. "You cut the bond yourself." In front of the whole pack, I felt every word of it tear loose. "A thing like that doesn't grow back because you've gone lonely in a big cold hall. Not cruelly, just true. Go and be a better king than you were a mate. It's the only apology I'll take from you." He stood there a moment, with his crown turning over in his hands, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to have no ground already agreed to be under his feet. "I thought," he said finally, "that when I came home and dissolved it, you would." He stopped. Whatever he had thought, he had enough left in him not to say it aloud, and she was almost grateful to him for that. "You thought I'd been waiting," she finished, not unkindly. "Osric, I was waiting. For years, I waited for you to look at me the way you looked at that hall full of spears. That's the part you'll have to carry. Not that you lost me. That I'd have been yours for the cost of a single honest glance, and you spent me instead on the thing you could count." He went. To his credit, he did not come again. And the pack, who had watched their alpha throw away the woman who then saved the realm at his own council table, drew its own quiet conclusions, and Osric lived inside them, which was punishment enough. She did not gloat over it. She had wanted, once, to be the reason that face looked stricken, and she found now that the wanting had simply gone, worn away like a stone in a stream, and its leaving felt less like triumph than like finally setting down a load she'd carried so long she'd stopped feeling it at all. Lycan was harder, because Lycan did not push. That was the unbearable part. A Lycan king could have taken Ashfell apart, stone by stone to win her back, and instead he wrote her letters. They came 2 and 3 a week, in his own heavy hand, carried down from Duskholt by a rider who looked increasingly embarrassed. Some were short. Some ran for pages, and weren't even about her. A border dispute he wanted her read on, a pension for a dead warden's widow, as though her honest opinion were still a thing worth having. One said only, "I keep writing the same word 100 ways. Sorry is a small, stupid coin for what I spent of you, and I haven't a larger one. So I'll keep sending it until it's worth something, or you tell me to stop." Another, "You said a thing that starts as a lie doesn't get to keep what it becomes. You were right that it started as a lie. You were wrong that I get no say in what it is now. But it's your say, not mine, and I'll wait on it however long it takes." And one, near the foot of a long page she had sworn to herself she would not finish, and had finished, anyway. "I told the whole hall I claimed you for spite, to teach Osric a lesson. That was true on the first night, and a lie by the third, and I let you go on believing the first version, because the true one gave you a weapon, and I am a coward about my own throat. I didn't want you back because you were useful. I keep trying to write it grander than it is, and it refuses to be grand. None of it matters if you're not in the room. That's the whole of it. That's all I've got." She kept them. She told herself she kept them for evidence, the way she kept everything, and she did not examine the drawer she kept them in or why it was the one that locked. She kept the bond closed. Leave a bond open and it deepened. Deepen and it set. So she kept it shut and hoped it would wither from neglect and let her sleep. It did not wither. Every night, the warm, patient thread sat exactly where it had always been, refusing to fade, and she lay in the warden captain's bed, with her hand over the scar Osric had cut, and Lycan had warmed and hated. How much of her was still listening for a rider from the north? "Talk to the man," Tamsin said, by the 5th month past all subtlety. "You're miserable. He's a high king, writing you 40 letters, and the rest of us have to stand here and watch." 43, said Wick, who apparently counted. "I was used," Elira said. "I'm not queuing up for a second turn. The border runs well. I'd like to be left to run it." Then, one night, deep in the 5th month, a letter came that was different. "Elira, you've made yourself plain, and I'll honor it. You deserved a king who told you the truth before he told you anything else, and I gave you the wrong order of things, and I can't unspend what I spent. I'll stop now. No more riders. When we meet on the realm's business, you'll find me only your ally, and never again your creditor. She read it twice. This was what she'd wanted. So why did it sit in her chest, like a stone going down a well? He kept his word. That was the worst of it. No more letters. When they crossed at the season's councils, he inclined his head. Warden, captain, even, courteous. Never cold. Just done. This is what you wanted, she told herself, and did her job, and did it well, and every single night, the thread under her ribs stayed exactly where it was and would not let her be until the knock. Wick, in her doorway, the color of a man who has run all the way up the West Range. "The Lycan king," he got out. "At the main gate, in full state. He's called the court to assemble." Her stomach dropped. Assemble for what? "They're saying," Wick swallowed, "they're saying he means to release the claim. Publicly. Speak the unnaming, and set you free of it before the whole pack, so there's no shadow on you when he's gone." He looked wretched. "He's leaving, Captain. Back to Duskholt. For good." She was on her feet before she'd decided to be. She would tell people, afterward, that it was duty, that a warden captain does not let a foreign sovereign stage a scene at her gate without oversight. It was not duty. It was the thread under her ribs going tight as a hauling line, and her own hand pressed to the scar, and the sudden unbearable certainty that if she let him speak the words that severed what Osric had begun, the cold seam in her chest would close over for good, and she would spend the rest of her life a competent, well-regarded, entirely hollow woman. She reached the gate court as the pack was still gathering. Lucan stood at its center in the last gray light, crownless for once, and he looked. She saw it the way 5 months of a closed bond had taught her not to. Tired all the way down, he lifted his head to begin. "People of Ashfell, I came to your hall 5 months past and laid a claim on one of your own for reasons that began in strategy, and I'll say it plainly since I owe her plain words. Became the truest thing I've—" "Don't," Alara said. The court turned. He stopped, the word half-formed, and she watched him brace the way he always had when something got too close to something real. She crossed the gate court to him. The pack made way for her the way it had learned to over 5 months. Not for the Lycans claimed Luna, but for the warden captain who ran their border and would take the head off anyone who slowed her down. She did not hurry because her knees weren't sure, but she did not stop. "Captain," Lucan said, and inclined his head, courteous. Done. Already halfway behind the wall he'd lived behind. Since he was 19. "This is a small piece of business, and then I'm gone. It's the right thing, it's the only clean thing left, to—" "You don't get to stand at my gate," she said low, only for him now, "and unmake it for me, and call that a kindness. You've spent 5 months trying to hand me back a choice by making it for me. Leaving, staying, claiming, unclaiming. Every one of them a thing you decided and called mine." Her voice was shaking, and she let it. "I have been a thing men decided about my whole life. Osric decided I was an error. Alder decided what I believed. You decided I was a message, and then you decided I was owed an apology, and now you decided I'm owed my freedom. And not once has anyone stood still long enough to let me decide anything back." She stepped in close. Close enough that the whole gathered court could see nothing of her face but the back of her head. Close enough that this last part was for him and no one else. "So stand still, Lucan. For once in your life, let someone choose you instead of managing you. Stand still, and let me." She reached up and pressed her palm flat to his jaw, the way she had on the colonnade, and she opened the bond. It hit her like a door blown off its hinges in a storm. Grief first, deep and bottomless, the twin of the one she'd been carrying since the record room. Then hope, raw and afraid to be hope. And under all of it, plain and warm and without a single angle, the fact of her, sitting in him like a lamp he'd stopped bothering to shade. No mask. The creature who hid everything, hiding nothing at all. Lucan made a sound like she'd struck him. "Elira, be quiet. I'm claiming you," she said, and the whole gate court heard the warden captain's voice go steady and formal and old. "I take the bond the moon laid between us. I claim you to my side, my hearth, and my name." She held his eyes and did not let hers fill, and lost that fight, and did not care. "Be nothing that isn't also mine." For a heartbeat, the apex predator of the whole realm, the Lycan king the packs told children about, simply stared at her, undone past speaking. She watched the certainty he'd worn since he was 19 come apart in his face. Not cracked this time, but simply set down, the whole weight of it, in front of her and the court, and the last gray light. Then the bond flooded back the other way, so much joy and disbelief and relief it buckled her, and he caught her against him with both arms, as though she might yet be taken back, and pressed his mouth to her hair, and she felt him shaking. Somewhere behind her, the gate court had begun, uncertainly, and then not uncertainly at all, to cheer. Wick loudest of anyone, Tamsin with her arms crossed and her eyes wet and her mouth insisting she was not doing anything of the kind. Ylira barely heard them. She had spent her whole life being decided about, and she had just in front of everyone, decided. No taking it back? He managed, ragged, into her hair. You said the words in front of witnesses. I have the whole court. I know how it works. Ylira said, into his chest. I'm the one who read you the law. One might still argue it was all Osric's doing, that if the Alpha King had only looked, just once, at the woman fate had carved out for him, none of it would ever have come to pass. Ylira had decided she was glad he hadn't. A man who could throw away a whole soul for 400 spears had no business keeping one. They wed at the turn of the year, at the edge of the deadwood, because she'd refused the great hall, and he'd only laughed and said the border suited them better anyway. The whole realm came out for it. The High King the Pax had feared, and the cast-out warden who'd seen the man behind the terror before anyone else had bothered to look. Lord Bevan sent his true alliance in gold. Osric did not come, which was its own small mercy. Tamsin wept and denied it. Wick lost count of something for once. Lycan cried during the vows. She'd known he would. She hadn't meant to, and the bond gave her away regardless. And he laughed at her through his own tears, until she stopped caring who saw. You're mine now, he murmured, when it was done. Forehead against hers, claimed and under your hand. No taking it back. Why would I take it back? Said Ylira, who had once been thrown away at the foot of a dais, and had gone and claimed a king of her own. I'm the one who did the claiming, if you'll recall. Best decision anyone in this realm ever made, Lycan agreed. She kissed him, and for once, she didn't argue. Later, years later, when a copper-haired daughter of their own asked to be told the story of how the Lycan king came to marry a border warden, and demanded, as children do, to know whose fault the whole thing had been, Ylira would think about it honestly for a moment, and then she would say that it had been the Alpha King's. For not looking, and she would mean it as the truest kind of thanks.